Today we're going to go over what Python libraries you should know as a data engineer. And we're going to go over this in kind of levels. So starting with more basic libraries you should know, and then moving into more advanced as you get more experienced. And I'll also reference a few maybe project ideas that you can build along the way. Now, if you don't know who I am, hey there guys, my name is Ben Rogojan, aka the Seattle Data Guy. I've been working as a data engineer for nearly a decade, and I've seen every transformation from on-prem to Hadoop to in the cloud. And I've worked at companies like Facebook, various startups, and then at this point just consult for various companies to help set up their data infrastructure. So let's dive right into what Python libraries you should know as a data engineer. Now, before going too fast into things, I want to take a moment to pause. Before jumping into all the libraries you could possibly learn, make sure you understand the basics of Python. And here is why. I did over 150 interviews at Facebook. And whenever I was interviewing someone who just came out of a data science like master's program, and I asked them a very simple question, often just requiring some sort of for loop in a dictionary or an array, list, this is Python, not Java or any other language, they would always come back with me to some sort of pandas solution, which is like bringing a chainsaw in a situation that required a scalpel. Yes, there are tons of powerful libraries out there that you can use, but it's very important that you master the core basics. Understand the various data types that Python offers, understand for loops, understand functions, understand classes, understand conditional statements. These are far more important than anything else because you're going to use them all the time. And if you want to switch into a different programming language, you're not tightly, stuck in this one library-based framework. I've literally worked with people who can use pandas every which direction, and as soon as they have to use a dictionary, they have no idea what they're doing. So take a moment. If you don't have the basics, I'll put a few possibly courses here picture-wise. Again, there's free, there's paid, whichever one you need. But now let's dive into the beginner level libraries you should know as a data engineer. First, and this is just for me the most obvious because I use it all the time, is the requests library. This is not a complex library at all. You're just writing basic requests. Really, I just generally use requests. So when you're using the requests library, it's usually as simple as just doing something like .get or .put or .post, and that's mostly it. Obviously, you'll add some data if that's required or authentication, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward, and most APIs that you're pulling data from will require you to use this. Now for a bonus, especially if you are going to work at a company that still uses SFTP, which at Facebook we did. Paramiko works great when you're using SFTP protocols. I guess I'm kind of using the word protocol twice there. Point being, it lets you work with SFTP very easily. Those are two kind of baseline libraries that are great to know. From there, it's good to know your database libraries. This could be something like scicopg2. I just always copy paste that, and I'm hoping that's how you say it. But I've used it so much for Postgres. That tends to be what a lot of people use if they're not using something like Snowflake or Redshift. It tends to be the general connector in terms of how you actually interact with Postgres. Now, honestly, you can kind of pick a few different libraries there. Like the Snowflake Python connector works very similarly. Most, or at least some of the kind of database libraries all work about the same, where it's like .execute, .fetch all. There's a few that don't, BigQuery being one of them. That's my least favorite library to work with when it comes to some sort of analytics platform solution. It's just a little bit chaotic. We'll get to that in the mid-level, but it's really important to know how you can interact with your various databases, as well as how you can actually loop through the results that are set back. And I think that's the other thing that's really important. You're constantly having to kind of go through those things, loop through them, or do something to them. So that's a great way to figure out, okay, how do I pull data? And then how do I use it from there? And here's a quick pause for a project idea. Take that request API, go and look up free data APIs. I'm going to put a link as well as kind of just scroll through a few here. Look for a few of these APIs that are open and free. Pull that data down and then use one of the database libraries and push the data to it. That's it. That's kind of your baseline first project. Be able to do that. And then from there, you can connect it to some sort of analytics or BI tool. But that's a great first, just quick project that makes you comfortable with two different libraries. From there, you could also learn something like BeautifulSoup in terms of having to parse HTML and like scrape websites. There's also Scrapey, whichever one you prefer. You can kind of play with both. You might have to actually use those in conjunction. And again, this is now you building a full project where you scrape the data, parse it out, and then insert it into a database. So again, two more great things to learn early on is BeautifulSoup and Scrapey. Okay, from there, a library I use all the time and always have to just check on how I use it over and over again is the Datetime library, because I'm constantly having to, feed some sort of parameter into a request API that is usually on the date. It usually filters on date. And usually they filter sometimes in different string formats. So I'm often using stringification of the date in Datetime, and then also using something like date, like today, dot whatever, stringify it, and so on. So I'm going to put up some examples of how to use Datetime. And then you also will often have to use the time delta feature for like saying like, oh, let's, go back a few days or something like that. So Datetime is something I'm constantly using. It's not a hard library per se, like it's very simple to understand. It's just something I don't commit to memory. Like SQL functions that have to do with date, because there's just so many different ways you can pull in and parse a date. All right, now let's step into the more mid-level kind of libraries you should know. Starting with Airflow. And if you read my newsletter, you'll know that Airflow right now makes up about 40%, or at least I shouldn't say 40%, 40% of the respondents, at least that filled out my survey, said they were using Airflow. And this could be biased. I have a lot of Airflow content, so I'm sure there could be some bias in terms of who I get in, but I will say this is pretty accurate in terms of what I've seen. So Airflow is a very common solution that people use. You can also check out Prefect. It is gaining some steam. So I think it's definitely worth at least looking at, so you know. But Airflow currently is great to know. And at the very least, if it ever does change, it will be good to know so you know how to migrate away from it. Next, let's talk about the various clouds. So you've got things like Boto 3, the Azure kind of core library, and all of Google's mess. I'm sorry, Google, I'm picking on you. I just, for some reason, get frustrated with all of the various things I have to pull or check that I need to pull every time I need to do like 2 or 3 things in GCP. But these are all libraries that let you interact with components in these various clouds. Boto 3 interacts with AWS, so you can do things like interact with S3 buckets or other solutions that are generally AWS components, because you can use, your Postgres library to essentially connect to an RDS instance rather than Boto 3. But things like S3 or Kinesis, you're likely going to need to use Boto 3 to kind of interact with. Same thing can be said with like GCP and Azure's core. Since we're mostly moving to the cloud for a lot of stuff, these are important to know because you will use them all the time. Next, I love recommending Flask. You can also learn Django if that's something you prefer. Flask to me is just super lightweight. Whether you're building an API or a website, it's really easy just to spin up and kind of use. That's really all it's for. Is it's great for kind of creating API endpoints that you can kind of push and pull from, get data to some sort of website, create some sort of basic MVC type site. So that's why I like Flask. Oh, and I forgot to mention this one in the beginner section, so maybe I'll edit this back or maybe I'll leave it here. But the virtual environment library is also great to know because you'll constantly be setting up virtual environments. You'll also be working with Docker maybe, but it's a great kind of first place to learn about virtual environments, how they work, how you can set them up. It's not super complex. You just kind of pip install it. And after that, just run like 2 or 3 commands on your CLI and you're pretty much done. So it's pretty simple. You don't have to know too much about it. Maybe you can dig into a little bit, but overall you can kind of abstract most of it away from yourself. Finally, let's talk about some advanced libraries that you could know. I didn't reference things like PySpark or PyKafka. These are good to know, so you at least know how to interact with things like Spark via Python. Obviously, there's always some discussion on whether it's worth, just using PySpark or learning Scala. But if you are only going to learn Python, or if you don't plan to learn Scala anytime soon and you have to interact with Spark, it is worth learning just so you have at least some way of interacting with Spark. It's a great interface. And the reason I kind of recommend it later in the advanced stage is because you should really have all these basics down first, likely, before digging too deep in all this other stuff. Now, if your job needs you to know it, then you should learn it immediately. But if you're not in a rush, I wouldn't run too fast for it if you're not using it. Same thing kind of goes with Arrow, and that's with most of these advanced options, or PyArrow more specifically. It's a good library to know, but are you going to use it every day? Maybe not. It's more focused on helping process and manage and kind of standardize data from that's big data. So it helps kind of store data in memory in a columnar format that makes it easier to process, as well as kind of managing data types. So it's a little easier, again, to process through these various solutions because there's always these weird data type issues. So it does a lot in terms of like managing performance, managing storage, managing data types. So it's really helpful and really effective, but also personally, I found it only has very specific use cases. So it's a great thing to know, but it has a limited set of use cases. Same thing again with PyKafka, PySpark. PyArrow, all these things are built for very, very specific use cases. Whereas the beginner and middle classes here, or libraries, kind of had a pretty broad set of use cases, and you'll kind of run into them over and over again. Everything in this advanced section is very limited for specific use cases. And you might run into them, or you might even work an entire career and never run into a reason to use them. It's totally possible. Again, in the survey I did, only about 50% of people said that they used Spark. So, take it for what you will. Obviously, that's a decent amount, but it's also not everyone. So there's plenty of companies out there that are not relying on Spark to be their main solution. Now, there are a ton of admin type libraries that you can learn, like OS, sys. I think you're going to run into those eventually regardless as you're working on your various projects. So I wouldn't get too caught up in having to dig deep in them. Speaking of projects, we can dig into a few more ideas here. I referenced Airflow before. I kind of have a part 1 that I'm going to finish probably sometimes this weekend video, just digging into Airflow, using MWAA to launch it. So that's one great example of how you could use Airflow. You can click here to actually learn more about that. You could also, once again, use your request library to pull data. And now instead of pushing it to some sort of local database, you could push it to S3 and then do something with the Snowflake Python connector via S3 using a stage. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of do this. So there's a ton you could do with these libraries alone. No need to rush. I recently had someone ask about how fast they should be doing certain things. As fast as it takes for you to actually learn and ingest this stuff. Learning isn't about speed. It's not about how much stuff can you shove into your brain at once and then not remember it 3 years later. It's about how much can you learn and then implement and use. So actually look for real use cases when you're building these projects. Anyways, guys, I want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks and goodbye.